Right.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to the Vermont Legislature's House Committee on Environment and Energy. This afternoon, we are going to be hearing about the Climate Action Plan and Natural Solutions with Jane Lazorchak, the Director of the Office of Climate. Welcome.
Thank you, Rep. Sheldon. Thank you, everyone, for having me here this afternoon. For the record, Jane Lazorchak. I work at the Agency of Natural Resources, and I direct with a now 6-month-old Climate Action Office within the Secretary's Office of the Agency of Natural Resources. So I have a presentation. Just to note, I did share with you all earlier, and my apologies, I called you the House Energy and Environment, but I changed it for my opening slide because I realized I made the mistake of putting energy before environment. So corrected that for my presentation today, but I'm going to walk through just understanding there's varying levels of sort of introduction to the Global Warming Solutions Act and the Climate Action Plan, just a few slides to sort of where we are today. And then what I'd really like to focus in on after highlighting some of the recommendations in the plan around natural and working land solutions is the work that we've been focused on over the last year to implement the plan and what that looks like, and answer any questions around that, specifically where we're going and what hasn't happened yet. And really grateful that Ryan Patch from the Ag Agency is here. There's a lot of ongoing work in the agricultural space. If there are specific questions around that, I am sure happy to defer to Ryan, who can speak in greater detail than I can. Go. Okay. So just a little bit of timeline. I think you largely are all familiar with the Global Warming Solutions Act. It was passed in September of 2020. First and foremost, that law really took goals that had been on the books for more than a decade around emissions reductions and made them statutory requirements. I'll speak to what those are in a little bit more detail. But this legislation was really sweeping and meant to attack climate change from sort of all angles, recognizing that we have a moral and now statutory obligation to cut our emissions, but appreciating that the climate is changing regardless, that we must also think about how we build resilience and adapt in our natural and working lands as well as our built environment. And there's also a requirement within the law around being net zero in 2050. And so we're thinking about solutions that foster and enhance sequestration and storage in our natural and working lands. The GWSA set up the Vermont Climate Council. The Vermont Climate Council is a 23-member body, 15 legislative appointments, 8 from the House, 7 from the Senate, and 8 administration officials. All of those, both agencies as well as private individuals who serve, represent various sectors and areas of the state that have a stake in climate solutions and climate action, ranging from environmental groups to farm and forest reps to renewable energy and fuel dealers. So that first meeting of the Climate Council was just about 6 weeks or so, actually almost 2 months past when the GWSA was enacted. It set forth a motion to move forward to adopting the state's initial climate action plan, which I like to highlight that when the GWSA passed, it had been envisioned to pass back in the spring when COVID hit. And so there was a delay of more than 6 months of passing the bill. And that timeline to stand up the first climate action plan was never extended out. So we had 13 months with the climate action plan to stand up the plan, with the Climate Council to stand up this initial plan. That was a very aggressive timeline. It sought to do not only the what was needed for climate action, but the how, the operational tasks of implementing that, which is very different from other states' plans. Maine's, for example, is an excellent plan, but it's very broad in nature. And our plan took a whole nother step down to really think about the roles and responsibilities, the implementers, and how we were going to move forward with implementation. I skipped over a key step, which is the subcommittees. In the GWSA, there were 4 subcommittees written into the law, and then discretion provided to the Climate Council to stand up any other subcommittees that were needed to do the work of the council. This is really where the technical, geographic diversity, and just broader range of ideas and people were brought into the process that really vetted the ideas and recommendations that were carried up to the council to deliberate on. The subcommittees are cross-sector mitigation that really looked at how and where we would cut our climate pollution. The Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee, which was really looking at natural and working land solutions. The Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, looking at really our built environment. Just Transitions, to think about the equitable transition of a decarbonization of our economy. As well as the Science and Data Committee, which was the 5th subcommittee stood up by the Climate Council to really inform the scientific underpinning of climate action. The plan was successfully adopted on December 1st. I like to joke that we were sitting there making final edits as the Climate Council was adopting it. It was really a sprint to that end, and we inherently called it, intentionally called it the initial climate action plan, appreciating that this was a plan to be updated, a living document. We immediately set forth, which you'll see in the work that we did over the last year, areas that we didn't finish recommendations in, and knew that we would be looking to addend and continue work over the last year, and have in fact adopted addendums in transportation, and are working to adopt an addendum around biomass, which I'll speak to in more detail today. And this plan is ongoing, has to be updated as a whole at least every 4 years, but again, can be adopted and considered sooner than that. The Climate Action Office was a direct recommendation that came out of the Climate Action Plan, a recognition that intergovernmental coordination was going to be key. The Agency of Natural Resources has a unique responsibility when it comes to the GWSA. We are the agency on the regulatory hook for meeting the emissions reduction. The cause of action speaks to ANR, but the role and reach of climate action is ANR has a large part to play, but only one of really a critical role of all state government in thinking about climate solutions. So we have partnerships with Ag, with Vermont Emergency Management, Transportation, Public Service Department, and an appreciation of how we were going to work together to prioritize, to speak to Vermonters and deliver action was really called out in the Climate Action Plan. And luckily the governor, with your support last year, put forward the proposal to staff and lead a climate action office out of the Agency of Natural Resources. So I'll just say that my role, I was the director of the Global Warming Solutions Act. I supported the Climate Council directly in drafting the first plan, and now have shifted into directing the Climate Action Office. Those roles and responsibilities that were directly left to support the Climate Council were sort of unique positions, myself and the GWSA coordinator, understanding and appreciating the sort of needed extra capacity and attention from state government and standing up the first plan. ANR still fully intends to support the Climate Council with respect to administrative capacity and fiduciary responsibilities, but the sort of direct personnel for the Climate Council no longer exists. Those positions have been redirected in the Climate Action Office. So I direct that work, and we have 6 positions underneath in the Climate Action Office covering resilience and adaptation, covering community engagement, natural and working lands, mitigation, and then data and monitoring, as well as direct fiscal support is envisioned also in our business office, appreciating that the Secretary's Office of the Agency of Natural Resources has been a very small and not an area where a lot of programmatic work has lived to date. And we have this unique opportunity with the EJ office and the Climate Action Office now in growing capacity and growing coordination of policies and measures that really are far-reaching above all 3 of our departments. So we're thinking about how to build capacity there.
Can I just ask, since you're on structure here, I'm curious then, what about the Climate Council and their work, and now they don't have staff support, it sounds like, and how's that shifted?
Yeah, so they don't have, they never had direct support. Obviously, we always worked for the Secretary, not the Climate Council. The Climate Council has never had their own staff to direct, but my exclusive responsibilities for a year were pretty much running the show of the Climate Council, because that was what was needed to move towards implementation and adoption of the first plan. The Climate Council is not meeting as often anymore. The subcommittees are meeting in varying levels. Some meet monthly, some haven't met, like the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee has only met a handful of times since the plan was adopted. It was an inordinate amount of work put on the back of volunteers, and I think there was a lot of burnout and fatigue. And so there's a recalibration of what is needed for the Climate Council going forward, and appreciation. We have built into our base funding of this Climate Action Office a contract to support facilitation services of the Climate Council, as well as meeting planning and public engagement that they are prioritizing. And the A&R staff still support sort of all the components of public meeting law, Freedom of Information Act requests, and administrative components of the Climate Council. But it's just less of a burden, and there is some tension around sort of the Climate Council having more capacity with staff that we don't have resources to do right now.
It may not be exactly the right time, but it feels very related. The governor said he's going to write a real plan. How does that relate to their work and that's already been done and what your work is?
Yeah.
Forward.
Yeah. The real plan quote really has to do with in my mind, the actionable items that the Climate Action Office is moving forward in the buildings and thermal sector. I think that we are very much working to complement and implement the Climate Action Plan. And I think the governor and the way that he's spoken to the real plan has been really around a staged approach with respect to reducing thermal emissions, and speaks to the need for better data with fuel reporting, as well as the buildings and thermal analysis that we're now doing, which I'll touch on in my implementation phase. But I view the plan as the Climate Action Plan, and the support and speaking to of specific action items in different areas is something that we're working to bring finer points and detail to through work. But that may not be a direct recommendation in the plan, but it's in support of strategies and actions in the plan. Hopefully that answers it.
And how do you anticipate utilizing the council now?
Yeah, we had 8 House members did not carry over this fall. So we had this opportunity for a new membership. 5 of the 8 members chose to come back onto the Climate Council to be reappointed. And the speaker recently did that, end of December and early January. Those 5 reappointments have been made. We had 3 vacancies, 3 members who chose to step off. The member for the Fuel Dealers Association, municipalities, and rural communities chose not to carry on. One of those, who was a former colleague of yours, former Representative David Dean, has now joined the council to represent rural communities. And we still have 2 vacancies for the fuel dealers, for fuel, as well as municipalities that the speaker has advertised right now. And so, and I'm sorry, that was a long-winded way to get at the answer to the question, which was, we have had a pause. We met in January briefly to approve the report to the legislature that A&R submitted on the Climate Council's behalf, but our meeting at the beginning of March for our first in-person meeting, for a longer meeting than normal, to really think about sort of capacity needs, roles and responsibility, and work planning for the coming year, in appreciation and recognition that the next Climate Action Plan is due in July 1st of 2025. And thinking about what's needed in the interim to get there and what their work looks like, and therefore what capacity is needed that A&R isn't supporting, to make sure that we can help bring the resources where needed to help support that work.
Thank you. Representative Smith.
Thank you. Can you tell me who the members of the General Assembly are that are on your board?
Members of the, you mean the House, the appointees? They're not actually, the only former representative is David Dean, but otherwise there are 8 House appointed seats and 7 Senate appointed seats that represent, like Johanna Miller from BNRC. She represents the environmental organization seat and is appointed by the House. And there are 15 of those. I'd be at the end of my presentation, and in what I sent to you is a link to our website, the climatechange.vermont.gov.
That would give me that information.
All the membership is there. Yeah, and
Thank you.
bios for them all.
Thank you.
There are no reps or senators on.
Yeah, no reps or senators. Yeah. So just appreciating that, again, ANR has a small but important role to help coordinate and roll out the implementation of the Climate Action Plan. Envisioned as we stood up the Climate Action Office was an interagency advisory board. So ironically, it's not dissimilar from the way the environmental justice work is now set up. There's an advisory council, and then there's a state government coordinating body. And now the Climate Action Office, we work with the Climate Council to put forward the Climate Action Plan, but we also have an interagency advisory board made up of the Public Service Department, Agency of Transportation, ANR, Vermont Emergency Management, the Ag Agency, Buildings and General Services, Agency of Human Services, Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and a state climatologist who has the distinction when you have a state climatologist of actually being awarded the title of State Climate Office. So that actually sits at UVM, the State Climate Office, with Dr. Leslie Ann Dupini-Giroux. And that's why we call ourselves the State Climate Action Office in ANR. And we have this direct overlap and coordination that is happening with her and her office and students to think about the roles and responsibilities that she is helping bring to bear and support in government, and then just the coordination across all of state government. And so the idea being that the objectives of this group are really around proactive coordination on climate action, thinking about prioritization of policy and financial implications, and ultimately really to support monitoring and progress over time of climate action. That report that we provide to the legislature on January 5th of every year is really, in my mind, an interim report of what will be a much more detailed monitoring and progress report of how we're meeting our climate goals. That was written very detailed into the Global Warming Solutions Act, and ANR has significant funding capacity to move forward with an RFP to first develop a process for figuring out what data and metrics are out there, inviting Vermonters in to think about how that we should be telling the story, and then ultimately building the tool and dashboards to communicate climate action over time. We see this as a 2 to 3 year process and have money built into our budget now, in addition to a request for fiscal year 24 for additional funds in the governor's budget. And then finally, I really think speaking and assimilating state climate action talking points. So working to be communicating and understanding each other's state agency priorities, and trying to work together in a more coordinated fashion to move those forward.
Representative Stebbins.
I answer my own question.
Oh, excellent.
So the Climate Action Plan, it was adopted. It has bold strategies and actions that speak to cutting our climate pollution. First, 26% below 2005 levels by 2025, and then a much harder and more ambitious target of cutting pollution by 40% below 1990 levels, that baseline year that we're measuring against changes between 2025 and 2030, making it roughly half of our emissions by 2030. The plan through the Just Transitions Committee strives to put those most affected first through the development of guiding principles and their ongoing work with the Just Transitions Committee in helping us think about how we implement and move forward policies that are equitable. Again, really shaped by the 5 subcommittees. And we had this unique opportunity this first time out of the gate to coordinate very closely with the Comprehensive Energy Plan. That plan is updated every 6 years. So it's a once every 12 years opportunity for us to have those 2 plans be really coordinated and developed together. And that was really beneficial to me coming into the job new and working really closely with the Public Service Department on that. It contains 24 pathways, which is the high level what, and then it gets all the way down to those 234 operational tasks that need to happen across all of the sectors. It includes this implementation section to inform decision-making and action around different implementers. So it speaks to the role of government, speaks to the role of nonprofits, the legislature, and others. And it included a framework for measuring progress, which is now what we're moving forward with in the development of what we're calling the Measuring and Assessing Progress tool. Just to give a little more context, I'm sure if you haven't seen the slide, it won't be the last time you see this slide. This speaks to our greenhouse gas inventory, which is really the backstop to the GWSA. So it is the tool that will let us know if we're meeting the statutory requirements. The most recent inventory to be published is actually 2017, and we are now in 2023. We are about to publish in the first quarter of this year an updated inventory through 2020. So we will have data in it from 2018, 19, and 20, catching us up, so to speak. But that is typical fashion for us to be roughly 2.5 to 3 years behind on data. And that largely lags because of two sectors. The buildings and thermal sector, we rely on national models that get scaled to Vermont, as well as the natural and working land sector. So both of those sectors are behind. We can't really keep pace with current calendar years. And so that is one of the reasons we've been advocating for better data, specifically in the buildings and thermal sector, so that we have more accurate and timely data for the transportation sector and buildings and thermal sector, which are our two largest sectors for emissions. And what you see on this graph in the solid color is the current data. And what you see in the shaded area is the projected data of where we need to go to meet our emissions reductions targets. So again, just noting that between 2025 and 2030, the line gets much steeper. And really, we are not on track to meet those emissions reductions requirements without significant policy intervention. So the 2025, we've seen a steady decline in our emissions. How long they will stay down, like in the transportation sector, based on impacts from COVID, are not known completely yet. But we have seen a steady trend downward due to just market pressure and the business as usual. But we will not hit 2030 without policy intervention. And what I would like to just highlight real quick is that our third largest sector, which we'll talk about in more detail about the work that we're collaborating on with the Ag Agency and elsewhere, is our agricultural sector in Vermont. That's sort of out of step with national emissions. Largely, typically, the electricity sector is the third largest sector, or even bigger in some states. And we've seen tremendous progress in our electricity sector due to renewable energy programs and the RES in particular. So we have a tremendous opportunity in the electricity sector for the near term, with capacity to shift the technologies in the buildings and thermal and transportation to clean electricity, which is not always the case in other states.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. I would like to see it. I don't know how possible it would be. That chart right there, I'd love to see that identical chart in relations to, say, Connecticut or New Jersey or New York, along the same type of a chart, to see exactly where we stand compared to the rest of the states.
By sector or just total emissions?
Just like that right there.
Yeah. Okay. I'm pretty sure
Is
it
that
exists.
possible?
Yeah, I would be happy to follow up with that. I'm pretty sure that exists for at least our neighboring states have very.
New Hampshire would be good to know too. I'd be curious to, because I think we do a pretty good job here in Vermont as far as environment goes. I'd just like to see what the rest of the states are doing. If it's impossible to do, I understand, but if it could be done, that'd be great. Thank you.
And of course, this chart is prepared by the Energy Action Network using Vermont state inventory data produced historically from the Department of Environmental Conservation, is where the greenhouse gas inventory lived, but that regulation and process has now moved into the Climate Action Office. Will do this. So
maybe an easier question would be, do you know how we stand as compared to the other states?
Well, our emissions overall, because we're a small state, are smaller in total by a lot. I think that we produce 8.6 roughly million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually. Globally, it's about 36 billion emissions. And so our total emissions are actually quite small as a small, not populated state. That said, I think one of the biggest differences is that our ag sector has much a larger share of our emissions than other states that are not ag states. And it also reflects our ability to how we track the ag sector, which is something that we're looking at very closely.
Thank you.
And what about our per capita emissions?
Yeah, I don't actually know the answer to that. Like individually, I would imagine they're relatively high because we have a relatively high standard of living and are wealthier, but I don't know that for a fact.
Representative Pat.
I think that's actually the critical measurement is the per capita, because of course, we're a small state with a small population. So within our political boundaries, our emissions are going to be less than a neighboring state, even New Hampshire, which has a lot more people than we do. So it really gets down to taking the total numbers, as you know, for the state, but then converting that to an estimate of per capita, which is, of course, is an average. It's not what I produce versus what someone else produces. It's what's on average. What is the average Vermonter is responsible for?
I don't know the answer to that, and it's a really good question that I'm surprised I haven't been asked before. Happy to look into it. And I do know that there was a really interesting New York Times article recently that showed emissions per capita based on counties, and they honed in on New York on Chittenden County, because Chittenden County was a very high per emission, like capita emissions. And it had to do with wealth, which we wouldn't happen to think about because it's like a more urban, denser area. You would think their emissions would be less than rural communities who are driving more and heating in older homes or things. But it's actually Chittenden County was by far more per capita than other counties in Vermont, which I thought was interesting. So just briefly, I just want to highlight that, again, the Global Warming Solutions Act gets a lot of attention for cutting climate pollution. Those are statutory mandates. We need to work to do that and figure out the pathway to legislation and other rules and components to meet those requirements. But again, comprehensive climate action looks across and provides benefits across all solutions, and really thinking about the natural and working lands here that we have and the co-benefits that they provide for the resilience and adaptation in our built environment, resilience and adaptation around biodiversity, natural, all of that is so critical. And so we're thinking a lot about a comprehensive approach to climate change and thinking about how to put solutions on the ground that meet all of these goals and objectives. So I'm just going to hit briefly and at very high level some of the recommendations that were put forward in the climate action plan around natural and working land solutions, since I was asked to touch on this. Generally, just to highlight, the focus of that Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee was really looking at the data that exists out there around the trend of where we are losing our forested lands on the landscape and also losing agricultural lands on our landscapes. So the focus isn't necessarily for us about the minutia of how to manage those. We are thinking a lot about solutions that enhance management for carbon benefits, but really the main goal of the strategies in the Climate Action Plan is about reversing the trend of losing these lands on the landscape, in particular agriculture, in particular working forests, in order so that they are there to provide the values that they provide long-term. So many of the solutions that were put forward around building resilience and adaptation are things that your committee has jurisdiction on and has worked on. It's thinking about in the future how we do a better job of quantifying the greenhouse gas benefits associated with practices that have been deployed for years that improve resilience and have the co-benefits of clean water. So we're thinking about cover crops, reduced tillage, expanded buffers, thinking about nature-based solutions and understanding and how we deploy traditional ecological knowledge, strategic conservation, healthy and connected river corridors and floodplains, and really thinking about the infrastructure that was needed to support and empower Vermont's natural and working landowners, again, so that they're there for us to provide all the benefits that they provide Vermont and our communities. As far as carbon storage, there have been a lot of conversations about legislation that was passed already last year, expansion to UVA to include reserve land forest. carbon markets, understanding both the benefits and challenges with carbon markets, and continuing down our path as a state to understand them as a tool. The payment for ecosystem services program that the Ag Agency has looked at on a working group for years with respect to agricultural lands, thinking about how we expand that for forest landowners to give them payment for services outside of timber management. So these were really the high level recommendations that came out of the plan. But as I sort of dive into what we've been up to over the last year, I think it will highlight sort of the key areas that we see as a catalyst for action. So luckily your committee actually talks about environment and energy. And so want to just highlight that we've had some tremendous success over the last year. In the climate action plan, it was a very proactive, incentive-based a plan that was sort of a hand back to the legislature to take action on. There was not a very regulatory nexus with this plan. However, I will highlight that based on the way the Global Warming Solutions Act was written, rules that are proposed in the climate action plan, ANR must advance on a very specific timeline. And all of the rules that were put forward in the initial climate action plan had to be adopted by the end of calendar year 2022. Luckily for us, the suite of the only rules that were proposed in the initial climate action plan built on decades of regulation that ANR had been already partnering with California on. You may know that you can either be party to federal car emission standards or you can be party to California. And you can only follow under the Clean Air Act, California or the federal government. You cannot, as a state, choose to regulate emissions in a different way than California or the federal government, largely to protect car manufacturers from having to comply with 50 different emissions reductions or different standards, I should say. So the rules that were put forward in the climate action plan built upon what we had already been doing around what was called Advanced Clean Cars. And Advanced Clean Cars 2 looks to build upon those regulations with increasing percentages of electric vehicles being delivered to Vermont for sale. It is not a mandate on you, the Vermonter, to buy those electric vehicles. The point of regulatory action is around the point of compliance, I should say, is around those cars being delivered to the car manufacturers in Vermont. That phase up starts in model year 2026. So it really is 2025 is when you start to see cars being delivered that are model year 2026. And then by 2035, all passenger car vehicles and light duty trucks will be, new vehicle sales will be electric in Vermont. Only, yeah.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. Does that mean that the state of Vermont will not be allowed to sell fossil fueled automobiles by 2035 period?
No, there will still be a robust used car market.
No, I'm talking new.
Yep. It means that Vermont will not be light duty vehicles, light duty trucks and all passenger vehicles will not be allowed to sell fossil fuel vehicles.
Can this ruling and law be changed with future legislatures?
Well, yes. So there are this is really built in partnership with OEMs, so manufacturers, because for years, these regulations and rules were intended to be market forcing. So they were percentages that were hard for car dealers to meet and they were intended to push the industry to deliver more electric vehicles. But this most up-to-date rulemaking was delivered to codify percentages that car manufacturers felt like they could deliver. And it was really a codification of what we saw the market going to do anyway with electric vehicles based on commitments car dealers had already made to deliver more electric vehicles, with many car dealers saying that they won't produce fossil fuel vehicles beyond 2030. And so this, we have a midterm review of the rule. Vermont participates with California and other participatory states with California regulations, where we'll review the rule and see if we're able to go as aggressively as we're going based on supply chain issues, based on how states are doing with EV charging, support of home charging, all the infrastructure that We expect to be there in 15 or not even 15, 12 years. But there is a chance for midterm review in the rulemaking process itself to back off. And then, of course, there has been even legislation introduced this year by the Vermont legislature to repeal those rules.
Are these rules standing in New Hampshire and Maine as well?
New Hampshire has never been party to any of the California regulations, but Maine, Massachusetts, and New York have all adopted advanced clean cars. Some have adopted advanced clean cars too, and all are committed to adopting advanced clean cars too. So New Hampshire tends to function like an island where they don't have these rules on the book, but if you're a car dealer and you want to be able to sell your car, and so you typically, even if you're delivering cars to New Hampshire, comply with California standards, because you might have a Vermonter who goes to New Hampshire to buy a vehicle and they want to register it here, and they wouldn't be able to register it if it wasn't meeting California standards. So New Hampshire tends to come along by default, but they have not implemented the rules.
It's what they say, live free or die is what they mean.
Right, yes.
Thank you.
And just really quickly, I'll just highlight what often isn't covered when we talk about these rules, because we really do focus on the phase out of internal combustion engine, is there are significant warranty protections, consumer right to repair protections, and other components of these rules that really help to protect consumer protection in a way that I think is really amazing and unparalleled. And I will say that advanced clean trucks is a new rule, one that Vermont had not followed on, and that does not envision a complete phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles for medium and heavy duty trucks. The technology is just not there yet. So there's an increasing percent of electric trucks to be delivered to Vermont, but not a full phase out. And the point of compliance for advanced clean trucks is different than clean cars, in that the point of compliance is once the manufacturer sells the vehicle. And we often really tout that as a better point of compliance, because it means that states and government have to support manufacturers in getting these vehicles out on the road, which is more helpful for them, I think, in making them feel confident that they'll sell these vehicles.
Representative Stem.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would you happen to have like a 2-paragraph or 3-paragraph write-up about advanced clean cars too? Because I don't know about everybody else, but I've gotten like 50 emails on this.
Yeah, I'm sure.
They're all form, but I think there's a lot of confusion and concern.
Mhm.
And if I recall correctly, we can back out of this any year. Am I totally misremembering that?
We revert to federal standards.
Okay.
So it's not like we revert to advanced clean cars 1 standards. We revert completely to federal law, which is different, and very much less stringent. But yes, we can. And I do have we have a great write-up on it
Thank you.
and talking points that we've put together for the rulemaking process too. I'd be happy to share.
Representative Tory.
So we have been, how long have we been following the California?
Since the late 90s, I believe 1997. I could be wrong, but that's in the
You're right.
but it's the late 90s.
Right.
Oh, you're right.
Mhm. And so finally, I'll just say, we also were able to adopt addendum to the climate action plan around transportation that the Climate Council put forward, that really speaks to empowering and sort of revisiting all the recommendations in transportation that look more broadly than just electrification, but speak to, compact settlement, bike ped, multi-modal transit, things that we haven't carried forward yet, as well as reinforce the need for better data in this sector too, and more refined data in the transportation space through a reporting program. And then finally signals the need for a sector-wide policy for the transportation sector, but doesn't say what yet. I think you all probably know that the main emissions target for the transportation sector was going to be met through the joining of TCIP. That fell apart about a week before the climate action plan was signed, with Massachusetts and Connecticut pulling out. And so now the Transportation Task Group and cross-sector has been looking at other policies and are really aligning with the state's carbon reduction strategy policy when AOT, Vermont Transportation, took on IIJA funding. One of those pots of funding was the carbon reduction funds, and they were required by taking and spending those funds to produce a carbon reduction strategy for the transportation sector. And that is Cambridge Analytics is doing that study right now for us that looked first at how far can you pull the policy levers within the transportation sector through the capital program. And then what is the gap that we still need to close for the transportation sector to meet the emissions reductions. I'll just say that this suite of rules gets us about a third of the way between now and 2030, closes our emissions, and it would get us all the way there likely for 2050 because it really looks at this ramp up of electric vehicles in later out years, but they're not enough to get us our 2030 requirements.
Getting a little concerned about time, hoping that we're setting the stage to spend some time on the natural lands.
Yeah. I'll just say that a lot more analysis is happening in buildings and thermal and transportation. Be happy to speak to anybody about those analyses.
Sure, we'll have you back to do that. Thank you.
Okay, so resilience and adaptation briefly, and then I'll go to natural and working lands. So I cover both of those for you before I wrap up. One of the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act was the development of a municipal climate toolkit to provide additional capacity and support to municipalities to take climate action, specifically around resilience and adaptation. Marion Wools, who was our GWSA coordinator, is now our resilience and adaptation coordinator, has been leading a diverse group of partners and state stakeholders to develop that toolkit, building off of existing tools, as well as understanding what capacity needs are for municipalities. And that tool will roll out this spring. And there's a request in our budget for fiscal year 24 to think about how we look to implement that toolkit along with the development of another tool, the Municipal Vulnerability Index tool that we're working on with contractor ERG to develop a tool that is a mapping tool that looks at socioeconomic and natural hazard vulnerabilities in communities to help prioritize where to direct funding and resources. And we've put forward an additional budget ask to speak to the implementation and partnership with RPCs in the coming years to roll these tools out. And we continue to sort of emphasize the struggle in this space around metrics for resilience and adaptation. There's a lot of feeling that the GWSA is too focused on cutting climate pollution, and that's because we don't have measurable objectives for resilience and adaptation goals right now within the climate action plan and as well in our progress tools. So as we're standing up, measuring and assessing progress, we are thinking about what the right metrics are to ensure that we are working as best we can and in the most strategic way as possible to think about resilience and adaptation in both our natural and working lands and our built environment. And the final comment I'll make around resilience and adaptation is that this past year, we completed a marginal cost abatement curve for mitigation actions that looked at sort of the capital investments needed and where you see those net benefits start to accrue. We want to do the same thing and have put forward an ask in our budget to do that for resilience and adaptation. We don't know of a state having done this at a statewide scale, but to try to make the argument for investments now in resilience and adaptation strategies, like replacing a culvert so you don't have to deal with a flooded community or moving of homes later. Those are the kinds of things we want to be able to see and speak to the capital investment needs that they pay back dividends later by making those choices and investments now. So that is a request for our upcoming budget next year to work on. So it's a priority. As far as natural and working lands, I think many of you probably know, it's linked. If you don't have it, I can share it with Rep. Sheldon again if it missed coming out to all of you, but we did produce a carbon budget for the initial climate action plan. In our most recent report to the legislature, I linked that report again just to highlight it, but that Climate Council report has many links to ongoing technical analyses that you may want to look at. But that carbon budget was the first comprehensive analysis of sequestration and storage in Vermont, looking across our forested lands, our agricultural lands and beyond, to understand what our current snapshot of sequestration and storage was. It was roughly 5 million metric tons. And so we have 8.6 million metric tons that we're emitting, 5 million metric tons that we're able to sequester and store. And at some point, those have to come together around our net zero target. And so we're thinking a lot about how we renew, refine that carbon budget and update it periodically as a check back on the net zero component of the GWSA goal. And so that was really a great success that we did it the first time, but there's more to build upon in that space. And I'll just say that we've had a biomass task group for the last year. Those recommendations that came out of the Ag and Eco subcommittee were tabled for inclusion in the climate action plan, largely because they came out of one subcommittee and were quite cross-cutting. They dealt with biomass for electricity generation. They touched on biomass for thermal application. And so the council said, we're not going to include this in the first plan. We're going to create a more cross-jurisdictional committee that looks at equity, looks at science, tracking, and come up with a new suite of recommendations to move forward. And that those recommendations have been drafted and the council intends to deliberate on them soon. We only just didn't get to it at the end of the year because of the House appointments sort of transitioning off and not having enough council members to continue meeting. So hopefully we will take that up this spring and act on them. Again, our partnership with Ag Agency really looks at how we track our ag emissions to ensure that we can accurately count and reflect the sort of co-benefits and greenhouse gas mitigation that we get from practices already being deployed and asked of our farmers. We have a very sort of gross, for lack of a better term, tool that really looks at the module that we use in our greenhouse gas inventory just at acres and cows. Doesn't really get at sort of practices, both from a gross emissions benefit and a net emissions. And so we have a contract now with ICF that we've worked on collaboratively with the Ag Agency to roll out in the coming months to review data and understand if that module is the best to use going forward. And finally, I'll just say around this, we're partnering with other states to look at accounting in the natural and working land sector and to think about what a net zero framework looks like for the Northeast and how to deploy regional strategies. There was a grant given to Maine, Vermont, and Massachusetts from the US Climate Alliance to do this work collaboratively to make sure that the accounting is accurate across the northern forest and natural and working lands, as well as the tools and decision-making that we deploy to protect these resources. So mindful of time, I'll just say that areas of focus going forward are really around data and measuring and tracking. That will be a really productive area in the coming year, working with Vermonters and consultants through an RFP and then ultimately through the development of the tool. All of these analyses have robust stakeholder engagement involved. We really see it critical to bring Vermonters along in the development of tools and recommendations to ensure they're part of the solution. And just last but not least, we have a position posted now in the Climate Action Office to support community engagement and communications. We're really excited that that is going to be a focus of our office. It's intended to intentionally coordinate with the EJ work so that we have a link between the services and communication and work that's being developed as part of the EJ law rolling out, as well as a mechanism for engaging with frontline and impacted communities. So we're not over tapping and over asking communities to weigh in state processes, but really thinking about a thoughtful way to do that long-term so that more voices can be around the table. I know it's a lot of information and I don't want to shortchange any of it, but hopefully that was helpful. And I'd be more than happy to speak to any of these things in more detail and highlight any of the work, especially in the natural and working land sector, in a more honed way at future committee hearings.
Great, thank you. That was a lot.
Yeah.
Right. We do have another witness waiting. So if anyone has a burning question, now. Otherwise, we will, I'm sure, be seeing more of Ms. Lazorchak.
Nicely done. My maiden name was Moskowitz.
Moskowitz.
Really a lateral move. I went from Russian to Czech. And then imagine I started in government with Moskowitz, and then when I had children, decided halfway through my marriage to switch. So it's really confusing for me.
Yeah, we just call you Jane.
You can just call me Jane. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks,
That was
Bill.
Mhm.
All right, we're going to take a break until 2:30, and then we do have another witness.